Welcome to the Art Against Mental Illness podcast. My name is Alex Lovelace and this is my podcast about the healing powers of art for artists, art lovers, the art curious and anyone with an interest in mental health and well-being. There are a few reasons why this podcast is coming out less frequently. Some of this I discussed in the last episode and I'm not going to rake up all that depressing stuff again. Suffice to say that my brain decided to stop playing ball. One consequence of what amounts to an onslaught of acute depression and anxiety is a marked dip in self-esteem. This is a very common cause and/or side effect of such mental illnesses. I'm not going to go into the neurological foundations of this, but suffice to say that humans that are feeling like they are some sort of godlike genius don't tend to be depressed. That's not to say that narcissists can't be depressed, it's just that depressed people are, by definition, not feeling very confident. With low self-esteem comes constant questioning of everything you do. That nagging sense of, what's the point? No one cares. I was never good at this stuff anyway. Everyone hates me. These thoughts are usually illusions, the malignant mirages of a malfunctioning brain, but they seem to be pretty real at the time and are hard to ignore. The little demon on your shoulder whispering nasty nothings. For viewers of Big Mouth, this is the shame wizard. This lovely fellow was at work while I was attempting to compile no less than 3 episodes of this podcast, subsequently aborted. I keep getting halfway through writing them and start thinking to myself, where am I going with this? This is self-indulgent nonsense. Who's going to care? I was just in the middle of a slightly maudling and self-pitying piece about how a tortured soul like me can't sell any of my tormented masterworks to simple folks who just want something pretty for their dining room wall, when such a fit of self-criticism struck. I literally stopped dead in my tracks and thought, this is a self-indulgent piece of dull nonsense that no one is going to want to hear. Now, this might well be the truth, but since it's the third such occasion that this has happened, it gave me some pause. I need to get another episode out, I thought to myself. I decided, yet again, to try something else. So I referred to my subject to cover in future episodes list, and it took me literally seconds to stumble across an item that was simply titled Overthinking. Bingo! If you hadn't noticed, as well as providing a medium for me to spout my ill-conceived ideas on artist therapy, I also use this podcast as a way to think through various issues, to order my thoughts, even to exercise my demons. So I immediately recognised an opportunity to work through my thoughts on overthinking, since that's exactly what led me to this point. Will I overthink this one too? I guess we'll find out. Overthinking is a trauma response. It is a form of anxiety that happens when your general anxiety levels are high and you're afraid of negative consequences from something that you're doing. It's a type of perfectionism that can completely paralyse you from a creative and productivity perspective. It manifests as a need to make sure that what you're going to make or what you're going to do or what you're going to say is perfect, and you become very worried about what might happen if that's not the case. This often involves internally play-acting the role of another person and how they might react to what you present to them. This usually leads to assuming the worst about how they're going to react or what they might say. It might not be obvious to you that that's what's going on at the time. It all seems very logical and rational, but that's the most pernicious thing about overthinking. It seems to you at that moment in time to be perfectly reasonable and rational, and that the task you have to do is really fraught with the danger that you think it is. If you're suffering from depression or anxiety, you're going to be more prone to having negative points of view or negative outlooks on anything that's happening in your life. Anxiety perpetuates anxiety, so it can be that anxiety in one part of your life, perhaps you're worried about something you said to a friend that you thought might be a little bit hurtful, and when you try and write some poetry or paint a picture, you start to worry about that instead. About whether anyone's going to like it or whether you think someone might find it hurtful or offensive. And you freeze, delay, procrastinate. You start to worry about the other areas in your life. And every time you get back to the project, you start to meander again and speculate and fret. But is this overthinking really a problem? A bit of reflection once in a while is a good thing, right? Well, let me be explicit about this. Overthinking is a poison to spontaneity. And art, regardless how you approach it, is underpinned by spontaneity. The strokes or the marks you put down on a canvas or paper, the notes you lay down on a piano, there's always a level of spontaneity that happens to create the thing in front of you. You are not a machine, you're a sentient being, and therefore the job of creation is a process, and it's necessarily spontaneous. Now, that's not to say that you're never going to produce something that is, in fact, offensive or boring or just plain bad. Sometimes you'll realise after the fact, or maybe during the creation of something, that it's not something that people are going to want to see, or maybe it's plagiarism, or maybe it just sucks balls. There have been some times when you've created something, you've looked back and gone, yeah, this is not great. Maybe you paint it out, Control-A, delete, throw it away, whatever. You just moved on, and you didn't freak out, the world didn't end, you just did something else. This is part of the learning and maturing process and a constant part of the creative process. After all, you can't be a genius all the time. You trust yourself to make judgment calls, because when you're creating, you're making lots of little judgment calls all the time. About what to put where, about in what order to do things, about what materials to use, so on, so forth. You trust yourself. You trust that you know, in your experience or from what you've been taught, that if I do thing A, then I get thing B. But we all make mistakes. We all make decisions that seem right at the time and don't turn out to be optimal. And then we just fix it, or we discard it, and we move on. You trust yourself and you trust in your skills. It's all very well, however, to, just decide not to overthink things. But it's often hard to know that you're overthinking, because by its nature it feels very real. This is just a basic fact of anxiety. Because if all your worries seem as ridiculous as they tend to when reflecting on them later, you wouldn't be anxious. This is a pernicious nature of anxiety. You might well be in a precarious situation. Maybe, like me, you've lost your job and your finances are getting tighter. Maybe someone close to you is ill. Maybe you're in a difficult relationship. Sometimes very bad things do happen, and we need to accept and prepare for those. We need to keep scanning the horizon for danger. This is just a fact of life. No big deal. But when you're feeling anxious or depressed, you start to see bad things everywhere. You start to look at every slightly adverse situation as a harbinger of something bad. You start to worry that you're going to run out of money, that you're going to be turfed out onto the street, and the world is going to end. And of course, that's possible. But you don't think about the fact that any number of other things could happen to alleviate or avoid this, and probably will. You forget that you have options, and that there's usually people around you who care and can help out. And positive chance events are just as likely as negative ones. The chances are the bad situation isn't as bad as you think it is, but when you're in a precarious situation where lots of things are not going well, and we all find ourselves in this position in one time or another, those things that seem like threats to you are going to seem much more imminent, much more likely, in fact, than they really are. And that's why talking to people like a therapist or a friend often helps. If they're the right type of person, they'll help you frame the problem in the terms of the reality around you that you're struggling to see. You don't get to forget about your problems, they don't magically disappear, but more often than not, when you look back on a time in your life where things were not going too well, and that there was lots of potential problems on the horizon, so few of them came about. Things didn't go at all how you thought they would. The worst case scenario, or even close to it, is usually much less likely than you think. Either way, you have no idea of what's coming down the line. You can control what you can control, and the rest is down to fate. And when the really bad things do happen, they often don't unfold as you think they're going to. And providing the bad thing wasn't fatal, you generally have a route to fight back. The only way is up from rock bottom. This amplification of risk tends to infect everything you do. Suddenly that relationship problem, those money woes, that issue at work starts to get in the way of literally everything. What's happening is your central nervous system has switched to fight or flight mode. You become perpetually hyper alert to risks of any sort. So instead of leaning into that short story that you've been looking forward to writing, you're suddenly questioning whether anyone would want to read it. You start worrying that you'd be ridiculed if anyone did so. You nitpick and analyse, and it all seems perfectly logical. Because you're an experienced and mature creator, you look at your own work critically, which is just what you're doing now, right? But this is the literary equivalent of thinking you see an intruder in every dark shadow in your house. You're not any less capable than you were a couple of weeks ago, but suddenly it seems that every thought you have is amateur drivel. So here I found myself, struggling to write one podcast episode after another. I think to myself, no one wants to hear me talking about this stuff. I came up with a subject and I thought, sounds great, but I've got nothing interesting to say on this, and there's a little voice at the back of my head that's drowned out by the shouting little demon, the shame wizard, that's saying, mate, you do this podcast because you've got good things to say. People listen to you in all sorts of circumstances because you have good things to say, and you tend to say them very well and very articulately. You know, I'm no genius at this. I'm not about to get offered a job as a TV presenter or whatever. Quite frankly, I'm only okay at this, but I'm better at it than many or perhaps most people are, and I can use it to help myself and other people because I find talking quite therapeutic. And I think some people find listening to people like me talking therapeutic, and that makes me feel good. And from that, I get the opposite of the anxiety spiraling feedback loop. If I can bring some light by using the ability that I have into someone else's world and relieve them of some of their burden, I can't think of a better way to use that ability. But I couldn't hear that sane voice. Only the shame wizard sounding sane and logical and telling me I suck. Call it writer's block, call it low self-esteem, call it procrastination, call it what you want. I stopped. I've talked about procrastination before, and I think procrastination and overthinking are very closely related, but not quite the same thing. With procrastination, you're avoiding doing something, usually by doing something else, which may or may not be productive. Whereas with overthinking, you obsess over something you've got to do. You can't seem to get it out of your head. You worry about it, you question it, you overanalyze it. This, in my mind, is all more serious than perhaps it sounds. Unhealthy thought loops are one of the main signs of pervasive unhealthy anxiety and depression, and precisely what therapies like CBT exist to combat. Sometimes this manifests as ruminating over a single thing. Sometimes you ruminate about anything and everything. Either way, your central nervous system gets stuck in panic mode, which triggers all sorts of other physical and psychological effects, most of which, over time, can cause lasting damage or worse. For creativity to be therapeutic, it needs to be relaxing, or at least absorbing. If it's creating anxiety, then it's exactly the opposite of what it needs to do. Maybe you're not in a position to diffuse all your other worries, but getting on top of your creative anxieties will set you on a good path to do exactly that. So what's the remedy for this? Well, at the risk of sounding obvious, it's to stop overthinking. Now, I know that's harder than it might seem, and it's sort of a bit of a contradiction in terms, but I think the reality is you've just got to do something. Most specifically, you've got to do anything. The cure for overthinking is action, and in many ways, it doesn't matter what action, just that you progress somehow. My most common form of overthinking when it comes to art is obsessing about coming up with a new idea, that next signature piece, something that will dazzle. Paradoxically, this usually comes off the back of a prior success and is delivered with a flavour of imposter syndrome. Were all my prior successes just accidents? What if I never do anything worthy again? The solution on such occasions is to do something else. That might sound a bit glib, almost a bit defeatist, but it's a bit like when you're trying to desperately remember something or to solve some tricky problem. Sometimes you've just got to stop trying, go do something else, sleep on it, then bam, the answer comes to you when you're doing something totally unrelated. From a creative perspective, I don't necessarily mean go do something completely different, like washing the car or whatever. You'll likely end up obsessing more. You need to do something absorbing, and preferably something creativity related that you can do while relaxing. You're not being lazy or weak by doing this, it's just a part of the creative process, and an essential one. Creation should feel natural, intuitive. If you force it, then your work will likely seem forced to other people, and you'll be eroding the joy that you naturally take from the process, a feeling that will stay with you through future works. This stuff accumulates over time like dirt and grit in an engine. Eventually, the engine seizes up. But what if you don't come back to the original project? Well, unless you had committed to it, then maybe it wasn't something you should have been doing, or maybe just not now. If you do come back to it, you'll find yourself looking at it with new eyes, a new perspective, and renewed enthusiasm. Your anxiety is forgotten, or perhaps even woven into your work. And please don't start stressing about whatever you end up doing to distract yourself. The point is to do something that you're comfortable with and that you enjoy doing, even if it doesn't feel like much of a step forward. What if you've committed to doing something and the reason you're stuck in a loop is that you're afraid that you're going to deliver something terrible? Perhaps you're already part way through a project and it's not panning out how you thought. Now you're worried that you've got to go back to the client with something crap, or maybe nothing at all. This is when you need to check in on yourself and apply a bit of logical thinking, as well as taking a break from it. Sometimes it's worth taking stock of your worldview from a probabilistic perspective and looking at it in a soberly and detached way. Maybe you've agreed to paint a portrait of someone, and this is a particular anxiety of mine. I've messed up these once or twice in the past. You've agreed to make a portrait of someone's beloved and it just doesn't go well. Well, it's not a good look and it's a bit depressing and embarrassing, and it really knocks your self-confidence. Most of us have messed up a bit in our professional lives or when we're dealing with other people. It's just part of life. At times like this, you've got to trust yourself. So maybe you have messed up in the past, but how many times have you nailed it? So if you've done, say, 50 portrait commissions in the past and one of them went astray, that's a 1 in 50 chance of screwing it up, which is pretty small odds of you doing it again. The odds of flubbing it are actually much lower because once you've messed up once, you're not going to mess up in that way again. And of course, that was past you, who is much less capable and awesome than you are now. These things never go smoothly anyway. How many times have you got halfway through a project and thought to yourself, what is this ridiculous assemblage of canine excrement, only to go on and craft a masterwork? And as every author knows, many works need a couple of attempts to get it right. Every time any of this happens, you learn from it, you move on, and you're better for it. There's a reason there's been 50-odd anxiety-free works between the last misdemeanor and now. You're damn good at this, so just get on with it. It's like being afraid of flying in case a plane crashes. As we all know, many tens of thousands of flights happen every day, and there's a crash like once every couple of years. There's a lottery-winning order probability of getting on a plane that takes a dive. I put my foot through the floor of my first floor studio a couple of weeks ago, so I suggest that, for me at least, the act of creation is more perilous than flying. So I think sometimes you've just got to take a step back and think about yourself and your situation soberly and objectively, and recognise that almost certainly you're being too pessimistic and overweighting the likelihoods of negative outcomes. And that's the core of all of this. Anxiety happens when your brain loses track of the real likelihood of bad things happening. Of course, sometimes our problems are real, but sometimes our worries about those real problems bleed into other parts of our lives. So remember this, overthinking is a form of anxiety, and as rational and as sensible as your ruminations and self-criticism seem, they're just another symptom of incipient anxiety. And what better way to relieve anxiety than the act of creation? So the question is, did I end up overthinking this one too? Well, I finished it, which I guess counts for something, but perhaps it's for you to decide. On the subject of not overthinking, I have a draft of the second instalment of my How to Be Creative series, so maybe you'll see that next. Or maybe I'll get distracted by something else. I guess we'll see. In other news, I now have a shop on my artist website, so you can buy my original artworks directly from there. There's at least 70 pieces up there at the moment, and more coming all the time. That's on alexloveless.co.uk/shop. And as ever, if you like this, tell at least one other person. And if you want to support me, then I have a Patreon account at patreon.com/alexloveless, where you can sign up with various different plans and support me financially. Otherwise, I'll see you soon.